asking all the time ourselves. And we need to find why it happened. And that's part of the historical research that we need to do. So, as Captain Ramachandran and the chief guest mentioned, the stories of resistance in the southern part of India has been phenomenal. But to the question as to why this is not in the mainstream historical narrative or in your history books of Indian history, let me point out two or three reasons in my analysis. The first one is 1857 got the identity to somewhat that India as a nation is an identity that was evolving. In the 1850s, post-1857, that gathered momentum. And mind you, this is the modern world. It's a Westphalian nation, concept. There's a very fine seminal work done by a scholar called Benedict Anderson, which talks about what is nation and nation state. Imagine communities. Communities imagine to get together and become one, and that concept of nation is an imagined community. That imagination began, or through the 1857 it began to coalesce. And then you find the Congress being born in 1885, started by a Britisher, Alan Actovian Humes, and then the freedom movement gathers momentum. So in memory, your nation state of India as a modern nation state evolves from this period. And therefore, when history is written, or when much of the history that you've learned from the British historians and then you rewrite the history, you're still looking at the north of India and the period after 1857, and therefore you define 1857 as the first war of independence. The British will still call it a Sepoy Mutiny, and we will discuss that a little later. So that's one of the important memories. My interest in history goes back to school days, and of course a lot of novels that I've read, historical novels were my passion. So whether it's Ponniyin Selvan or Kalkis or Agilans or Na Parthasarathi's or many of those periods I've read in the school days. And then moved on into my military career, then it becomes a history from military history perspective and international geopolitics perspective. But the reason why this has been still a victor's narrative from the British perspective, as the chief guest pointed out, is that in school, the first question that I asked was, what is the fundamental source of our history learning? History of India by Vincent Smith. And when I read the Gupta's period, there is an emperor called Samudragupta, and he does a Digvijaya and comes down to almost the northern borders of Tamil Nadu, goes back. And Vincent Smith describes him as a great emperor. He should be called as Napoleon of India. I said, excuse me, Napoleon came 1300 years later. On the other hand, you should call Napoleon Samudragupta of France. Why is this? Because Vincent Smith, his history book was a Bible for most of our history learning. We had a fabulous library in school, and so R.C. Majumdar's 5-volume Indian history was available. And all of those 5 volumes, you'll find not more than 100 or 50 pages on South Indian history. That's it. The only book that I found enjoyable that covers some aspect of South Indian history and importance is A.L. Bhashyam. For long, I thought Bhashyam was an Indian and a Brahmin name. Little did I know that he was a Britisher, and he was from Oxford and Cambridge. And it's a very finely written book and provides a fair amount of coverage to, particularly on the literature and the culture side, on this India as a holistic, from a holistic perspective. But let's come back to the subject again. So there were many factors that came around to create what happened in India from the 17th century onwards. The Europeans first came in 17th century. They came as traders. How did these traders become occupiers? How did these traders colonize country? And what were we? Few events, historical events must be understood quite well. This Tamil region, the southern part of the peninsula, was always fiercely combative. When you study Chinese history, before the Qin Empire comes into existence, there's a period called Warring States period. For 400 years, over 13 or 14 Chinese small kingdoms keep fighting with each other. Finally, the Qin kingdom prevails over everyone. The first empire comes into existence. The Qin emperor declares himself the empire of all under heaven. Right? He survived only for about less than 20 years. Then the Han dynasty comes in, who rules for 400 years. But the warring period produced some phenomenal giants like Sun Tzu, Confucius. All these names we are familiar with. If you go back and analyze the history of South India, particularly the Tamil region, the Cheras, Cholas and Pandyas and later Pallavas were constantly at war with each other. You had a warring states period of 2000 years, each one trying to be one above the other. But when it came to an invasion from the north, the Tamil kingdom got together. So when the Mauryan Empire came down to expand its empire into the Tamil kingdom, Ilanjay Chenni headed the Tamil Confederacy to stop the Mauryas at the Vengadam Hills. That is the history. And that is a practice that has always been there throughout history. You need to understand this. There was a very fine book, again in my school days, that I read, was Tennattu Porkalangal by Ka Apathurai. And it went out of print maybe in the 70s. Very recently, maybe about 7-8 years ago, I found an English translation is available, and now it's coming back in print. He analyzes the complete, Tamil history in terms of warfare, in terms of battles that have been fought. There is a phenomenal warfare history in this region. And that was not going to let the Europeans come in easily. So what happened? Why was the fragmentation, as you mentioned? Why was so much of, the British or the Europeans were able to get through? Somewhere around the 13th century, when Malik Kafur came in, just before him, you had the Cholas vanquished by Jatavarman Sudrapandian, and then the Pandyas lasted for a while, and then they collapsed. The Cheras, Cholas, Pandyas vanished. After over 2,000 years of continuous existence, they vanished. Of course, you had these fragmented kingdoms in Kerala, and the others were all smaller kingdoms. Then Vijayanagar came in the aftermath of Malik Kafur, and Vijayanagar became a fabulous empire. And Battle of Talekota killed Vijayanagar. The surviving Tirumala prince went and ruled for another nearly 100 years till the early 17th century, middle of 17th century from Chandragiri. But the result of the Battle of Talekota was the fragmentation of the empire. They were administrative units. Palayams were administrative units under Vijayanagar. So when Vijayanagar, the central authority, vanished, the Palayams became independent chieftains. And who were the Palayams? It was like the feudal system in Britain. They were the leaders of the local regions. They collected taxes, they built their forces, and they provided the forces to the central army. So when the central authority vanished, each one was an independent chieftain, independent king. So when the East India Company now came in, you had this situation. When the Nawab of Arcot came in first before him, and then he tried to collect taxes across, he was dealing with 77 Palayams, as you actually mentioned in the book. Okay, it's a Herculean task. And he was a corrupt and a weak, governor. He wasn't a king, he was a governor appointed by the Mughals. And then the Europeans understood this fragmentation, and they started now taking advantage, playing one against each other. That's how Dupleix comes in, that's how Clive comes in, that's how the East India Company. So the whole starting of the European colonization is in South India. And for more than nearly 2 centuries, as the book brings out beautifully, the resistance has been phenomenal. Fiercely fought. and extremely contested. Unfortunately, the concept of modern India had not evolved. And therefore, when history was rewritten or is being written, you are starting off from the point where the concept of modern India has evolved, which is post-1857, and therefore you flag 1857 as the first war of independence, but you forget that for nearly 2 centuries, people have contested enormously, and they've had a toughest time. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon, cut his teeth here against these 15 chapters that cover here. One of them fought against him. All right. In later interview, towards his, end of his life, in a discussion, when somebody asked him, what was the toughest battle that you fought? Wellesley says, it's the Battle of Versailles. And where was the Battle of Versailles? Against the Peshwas. With a much smaller force, he fought against them. And this brings about few things that the British did very smartly. And Captain Ramson brings that out too in one of the chapters, is that the Polida Wars, or the Palakkad Wars, was something that lasted for nearly 50 to 70 years. Finally, when they vanquished Kattabomman, then the Marudu Pandyas take over, Umathare and Marudu Pandyas take over, and they carry on for another 5-7 years. And then they are vanquished. Now they do a trick. They do a trick by asking the Nawab of Arcot to invite the southern region polygars, who are about 32 of them, for a peace meeting and settle the issues, and we'll have a peaceful coexistence, is the message that's been sent. They all come here to Arcot, and they've been rounded up, imprisoned, and they were the first exiles to Penang. By one record, it's Penang. And almost a decade ago, I read a research paper written by a Chinese scholar, and he says they were the first exiles to Burma. For the next 30 years, none of them returned. One returned after 30 years in his old age, in his 80s. But this one act created a phenomenal result. What did that do? The kings or the chieftains were your employers. They managed, they collected taxes, they created avenues for providing livelihood for people. And when they were removed from the scene, the people were left without any kind of a provision for livelihood and existence. And then East India Company steps in, recruits all the martial background people from the southern Tamil Nadu, and says, we will make you sepoys, you come into our employment, you'll have a guaranteed livelihood. That was the beginning of the Indian Army. That is the beginning of this entire process. So when the Austrian scholar asked me, how is it that this 40 million island nation enslaved 300 million country, I said, we helped them enslave ourselves. The Indian soldiers. We were the Indian army under the East India Company defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla. The Indian army defeated the Peshwas. The Indian army vanquished, under Arthur Wellesley, vanquished Tipu Sultan. The Indian army, Madras infantry at that point of time, killed all of these heroes. Right? But this resistance that has been built in, which is actually reflective of the innate spirit that exists in the people, is something that needs to be highlighted. The story of Rani Velu Nachiyar, you talk about Bharati's Pudumai pen, and this is in the 18th century. She was very well educated. She was very well versed with warfare, including war fighting, horse riding. She could speak Tamil, Urdu, French, and English. And Hyder Ali was impressed with her fluency and mastery of Urdu. And that's how we actually, decided to support her. Okay, so this is the kind of a culture we had. Where is all this being explained? The martial cultures, we now understand old cultures. We've been actually originators of martial cultures and martial arts to many other countries. Correct? War fighting has been immense here. And if you go back into now that people are aware of Cholas, there are records that are available. The first battle that Rajaraja Chola launched as a prince, when Madurandagan was the king, was made the emperor, and then he launches the attack on a small place, Kandalur Chalai, which is between Trivandrum and Kanyakumari. And people get thoughts. Kandalur Chalai Kalamarutta is the eulogy that is put in Rajarajan's eulogy there. What does that mean? So when people research into it, Chalai can mean a street, can mean a school. Kandalur Chalai was a martial training school. The Cheras were a thorn on the sides of the Cholas. And the Cheras were exceptional in military training and military strategy training. And Kandalur Chalai was the brainchild or the brain power of the military power of the Cheras. And therefore he says, let me kill the head of the cobra and then vanquish the Cheras. So this is the culture that we have. These are things that needs to be explained. Correct? And I believe Captain Ramachandra's book is the start of this process. We have a lot more work to do. But congratulations, sir, for this wonderful book. And each of the 15 chapters have been excellent. And I was very happy reading it and enjoyed reading it absolutely thoroughly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I now request our guest of honor, Rear Admiral Dhingra, to say a few words.
Dignitaries of the dais, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. At the outset, sir, heartiest congratulations on the launch of your book, and I consider myself absolutely privileged and humbled in equal measure to be a part of this launch ceremony. Doing so in the presence of this august gathering is even more humbling for me, sir. As a naval officer myself, and in the company of so many esteemed veterans this evening, to claim that the pen is mightier than the sword may not be exactly the most politically correct statement. But the fact remains that stories of strife and struggle, of war and sacrifices need to be told. So when we have an officer who turns author, we can rest assured that our responsibility towards the next generation is well taken care of. The famous war of 1971 has been documented rather well. Much has been written and said about it. Largely so because we are fortunate to have many of the first-hand witnesses of the war who have a story to tell to us. And yet, going through the pages of Captain Ramachandran's book, Legion of the Brave, I felt that weaving of fact and fiction was a masterstroke in making the narrative much more riveting, engrossing, especially so for young readers. My compliments to you, sir, for the might of your pen, without which the glorious story of the might of the sword would have possibly risked extinction. In my service of 33 years, this has been my first appointment in southern India. And I feel immense gratitude to the service and God alike for giving me the opportunity. Chennai has been our home for the last 16 months, and I can safely say that the history classes in school didn't teach us as much about the Cholas, the Cheras, the Pandavas, the Satavahanas, and the Pallavas as much as I have learned in the land in the last 16 months here. Be it the mesmerizing temple architecture, the historical trade routes, or the innumerable stories of the brave kings of the region, the more I discover, the more there is to know. The launch of Captain Ramachandran's book for me personally could not have come at a better time. As a soldier serving in the region and as a citizen of the country whose interest in history have been reignited. I cannot wait to turn the pages of Captain Ramachandran's new book, Unconquered Horizons. And from what I've been hearing from our guests who just spoke before us, I think it would be the perfect bridge from what we have learned as history of the Cholas and the Pandavas and the Pallavas to what is actually the history of India being born. Heartiest congratulations to you, sir. May your pen keep passing down to the generation stories of war, of strife and struggle, of combat and conflict, but above all, of heroes, their sacrifices, and their ensuing victory. Finally, I'd like to express my utmost admiration and heartfelt respect for everything that Colors of Glory stands for. Military history would indeed be limited to only a handful of people, if not told to the world. Kudos to the Foundation for its selfless service in promoting awareness of India's proud military heritage. More so now, of talking about how the southern states were standing in equal measure to be a part of the India reborn. History, if not told, will fade away into oblivion. Our gratitude to Captain Ramachandran and Colors of Glory for this invincible partnership between the pen and the sword. Thank you, sir. Thank you, gathering. Jai Hind.
We will now have our Q&A session.
You can read it. Okay. I thought he read it out.
Okay, the first question is from Akshay in Hosur. Okay. What lessons can contemporary leaders and movements learn from the strategies and resilience of South India's resistance icons? How is it relevant today?
The lesson the contemporary youth can learn is that we are a fighting people, as Martin was saying. Our martial heritage is something which is not known. And there's a reluctance. In fact, I heard a naval officer once speaking that, the Cholas went all the way up to Southeast Asia. Where all they sort of conquered. But today, we have in Tamil Nadu boys who cannot even swim. So we should get rid of that, and it's okay, pursue whatever you want. But we should not become docile. So that is the lesson we can learn from these legends. I hope that answers.
Absolutely. I'd like to actually flag one of the important reasons why, again, these icons have been, not discussed or brought into people's memory. The British were smart. After 1857, and until 1857, much of the British Raj was built by forces that were formed in Madras and Bengal. Post 1857, they said the mutiny started from Bengal, right? And some of the loyal forces to the British Raj who quelled the 1857 War of Independence belonged to the just conquered regions in the northwest, Punjab and the Indus regions and the Pathans, etc. Therefore, they started a policy, a big humbug called martial races policy. There was nothing more idiotic than this one. But this was a divide and rule strategy. So, there was a guy called Lord Roberts who insisted on changing the recruitment policy. And one of the drivers was also that there were more people after the presidencies became more open to getting people educated. There were more educated people in the south than in the north, and therefore they wanted people from the regions of the Punjab, Rajasthan, those areas. So Roberts kept insisting, and then finally in 1895, this policy is implemented. Now there is less recruitment from the south, and that gradually goes down to below 20%, and 80% are from, before 1947, the majority recruitment orientation was towards Muslims in the northwest. And then, of course, the other, Gorkhas, Sikhs, and, the regions in Rajasthan. Well, now the world knows that this is illogical. And many of the major battles, even in the world wars, the Madras Regiment has played, quite an important role, in the fight in the World War I against the Ottomans, and there are many other cases as well. So post 47, Cariappa decided to change this, but we've still hung on to it. The Indian Army still, I think, has not removed this. This is one of the reasons. So I think relearning your history, researching into your history, and bringing out these stories will contribute immensely to change the mindset. Let's get out of this, colonial mindset that's imbibed, that's been brainwashed on the people for the last nearly 500 years. I think we need to get out of it.
Can I just add? I'd like to just add what he said about this divide and rule is true in more ways than one. Because when the British came, we all in our history books are taught that the Mughals had the empire which the British took over. It wasn't. It was the Marathas who would have been ruling India but for the Third Battle of Panipat. What the British did was they found that the resistance to them came from the Deccan, whereas the states of the northwest, especially Punjab and the areas bordering Afghanistan, what is contemporary Pakistan, were all willing to be employed by the British. So they built up a new thing, which was the schooling. Now, this region, the Deccan, had a tradition. Even in Tamil Nadu, you had what's called Thinnai Palli, where all boys of all castes, not girls unfortunately, but all the boys of all the castes sat together in the Thinnai. Thinnai is the front veranda of the house, and they were taught. What the British did was stop the Thinnai Pallis and they started schools, lots of schools, and they brought out this image that the South Indian, the Maratha and all were very studious, very educated. Good. I mean, they made them into educated people, but they said they did not fight. They were good only for study. So they made them into a group of educated people, but who did not go to war. But it was the Deccan which gave them all the trouble, if you go back into history.
Okay.
Since the martial races theory came, just a word I want to add about it, which is a subject I've been researching on a lot. You see, most of these initial wars the British waged in India, I mean, actually it was a case of the Indians conquering India for the British.
Yes.
It is not that the British brought their troops or something. And why were these sepoys fighting under them? See, our Rajas and Nawabs, which I mentioned about, they had no organized military, nothing. They will just put together a rabble whenever there's a fight between them and in the they look at the other force. I'm not talking about ancient times when we had proper armies. Here, and when the colonialism started, this was the situation. They look at the size, whichever is the smaller army, they'll just turn tail and walk off. So there's no fighting. So then there are a lot of once this war, the quarrel between the states are over, These are jobless, no pension, nothing. There are a lot of footloose mercenaries there going around. So for them, fighting was an honorable profession. And when the French started it first, actually recruiting, and then they found they were paid properly, they're trained, and they could win battles. They were very happy. And the French or the British, as far as they were concerned, they just wanted to play. That was the behavior of the Nawabs in this thing. Just give you one example, sorry for going so long. This Plassey said it was nothing. Buxar was where the Mughal Empire was destroyed. There, 40,000 soldiers there assembled, so-called soldiers. The Mughal combined armies of Nawab of Oudh and Nawab of Bengal and Shah of Mughal Empire. Hector Monroe had 6,000 sepoys and 1,000 Europeans. That's all. 7,000, about 40,000. And in 1 hour the battle was over. The Mughal army was routed. This was the kind of rabble they were assembling. Whereas these men, they found, it's good, we can win wars. And most of these wars, initial stages, won by South Indians and Biharis, incidentally, when they started recruiting. Biharis were thrown out after the 1857 But once this theatre of war shifted north and northwestward, this was not a time when troops could be airlifted. This is bullock cars. In fact, for the campaign against Tipu Sultan, it took almost near to assemble people from various places in Nellore and Malakka to Serengapattam. This was the situation. So they found it's highly uneconomical to take troops from all the way to south to this place. Instead, they sent the Madras army to Burma. I don't know how many of you know that the entire Burma was conquered by Madras army. Madras army went up to Manila and much before the US Marines landed in the Philippines, they took it. So then they went north and they found it is, Punjabis are near, they were more suited by climate also for that area. They started it. So they wanted to appease them. They made up this Marshall theory, Marshall Divisions theory.
It was purely a divide and
It is no scientific base, nothing. Now it is accepted. South Indians, meanwhile, education had developed here, and since they were not recruiting into the army, they looked for other avenues, maybe migrated to Burma and things like that. And soldiering, interest in soldiering waned. That is what, and that continues today. This is what happened. But there is nothing called martial races as such. They're all good, and as many battles are proving now. Thank you.
Okay, this one question on what challenges did you face while researching this book, particularly in uncovering and interpreting historical records for the resistance movements?
I can get you.
What challenges did you face in the research?
Oh, I see. Yeah, challenges I did face because, what we generally get is outline stories. But to make a story interesting, we got to go into more how exactly, where it happened. For example, I grew up in Travancore. I knew about a bit of Travancore history, about Velitambi Taloda. It's one of the chapters. How did he end? How was his end? So I had to go to the Travancore Gazette, like for Raja of Pur guy to go to the Mysore Gazette. The Archaeological Survey of India Library, like that, you have to dig. You cannot just find information without doing that. That was the challenge.
Okay, the next one is on how do you think the legacy of these southern Indian resistance icons should influence our understanding of India's broader struggle for independence? Is there a direct impact on our struggle for independence? Okay, let me just explain this. What were these icons fighting for? Independence. To preserve their sovereignty, to preserve their freedom, and to preserve their way of life. The British were wanting to collect taxes from them and literally looting that. So they were wanting to preserve each palayam's, each region's independence. So if you really understand the India's freedom movement, it must start from here, from the 17th century, when the first resistance movement from Polygal started off against the East India Company, or from the time the Nawab of Arcot allowed the East India Company to collect taxes on their behalf, and the resistance started from there.
I think that answers.
Okay. In what ways did the resistance in southern India differ from the more commonly recognized struggles in other parts of the country, like the battles in northern India?
In what way? Did it differ?
Differ from northern.
Resistance movement of the kind which took, I'm talking about resistance movement, not about independent struggles. And many of these, media journalists, they confuse. For example, there was this big controversy going on. Tipu Sultan was a freedom fighter, one side saying, the other side saying that, he was a religious bigot or whatever. Being a politically neutral person, I would say he was neither. He was basically a product of the times. He was one of those seeking power and territory. So wherever sort of brutality against the invader was part of the invasions of those days. For example, he was trounced by this, what they call Nayar Patalam in Trichur, the Nayar army of Travancore. So he had a grudge against Nayars. He couldn't take it out against them, but he went to Malabar, he took it out against them. Same thing happened when he fought against Kurgis, Coors rather. Kurgos, they were good fighters, and they are still. So when Kurgos invaded, he did the same thing there. It's like that. Otherwise, he used to do pujas at the Rangala Swami temple before going for war. There was nothing called religious bigotry or something. He was, he had to do what everyone was doing. So he was no freedom fighter. He was a freedom fighter. Just to add one more thing on that, one of the greatest thinkers of those times was Madhav Sindhi, who was a Maratha statesman. He had sent word around to all these rulers around Nizam, Mysore, Tipu Sultan, various people, let's get together against this. Tipu Sultan didn't join it because he was a Hindu. So this sort of division in our country.
We were fragmented.
Huh?
We were fragmented.
We were fragmented in various, either religion, caste, region. We were just not a nation. That is what happened.
You had Hyder Ali supporting British against the
Yeah.
Peshwa supporting the British against somebody else. So this kind of a fragmentation is what was the problem, really speaking. But everybody was fighting for their, preserving their independence.
So how did the fight in South differ? It was bitter. It stalled the British a lot. British couldn't just make a cakewalk like they did in the North. They paid in blood.
But studying history, I just want to end with one few points here. We need to study this history and we need to understand few larger dimensions of, because it is not only about Indian history. The colonization has a lot of other influences and implications that played into how the colonization started. When they came in as traders, the Portuguese, the pirates, the British and the Dutch, etc., came begging for trade. And what could they sell us? We didn't want anything from them. Literally, because India and China were exporting a lot to rest of the world. And they were looking for those spices, textiles, indigo, a whole lot of things. So, if you look at the trade pattern, the Henry the Navigator from Lisbon, last year I went and saw the museum there. Wonderful. And Henry the Navigator started off that process in the 14th century. And then when Columbus reached and discovered the new land, thinking that it was India, there is a fine book of American history called People's History of America, written by Howard Zins. It was written in the 60s or 50s. And that actually is a more neutral and truthful analysis of what these guys did when they went there. So as the colonization, they found that these are worlds that they could capture easily because of the gunpowder revolution advantage that they had. So they picked up their, strategies from there. That's one. And then the American colonies started before Indian colonization started. So the Virginia and Maryland came up. And when who were the people who moved? There was a population boom in Europe and England particularly. A serious poverty, lack of employment. So the king started pushing people to go and work in plantations where the elites had gone and occupied some of the lands in Virginia and Maryland. And therefore these were the people who went as indentured laborers and some of them as enslaved as well. They were both whites and British citizens as well as the African American people. So in the early 1600s till a date of 1664, there was no difference between white and African origin people or no color consciousness at all. It wasn't there. Right? So they had the same rights. The contract, it was a contract system. The indenture period was for 9 years to 15 years or whatever it is. And then they were free. And even an African descent person, when he becomes free, he could stand for, political office or he could, do his own business. There was nothing stopped. And intermarriage between blacks and whites were common at that point. Somewhere along the line, a rebellion took place by all these workers, both blacks and whites included. And that rebellion in Virginia carried on in 1676 for an entire year. And that shook up the British, they were both British colonies, shook up the British colonial past. And they said this cannot happen. That's when they brought in the law that you cannot intermarry. Whites will have privileges after the end of their indenture. They can actually you have to provide them guns and you have to provide them wealth. And the blacks did not have that option. And from there on, the slavery process started. So the white supremacy, the whiteness, and this is being researched very well now. There are some excellent scholars who are coming out in these discussions. And I picked up a book called 1619 Project, which is actually shaken up. All this comes under critical race theory. And therefore, when you now revisit history, this is an important milestone that impacts colonization in the rest of the world. That white supremacy, Christian evangelism that says Christianity is way above, others are uncivilized, you have a civilizing mission, and this is transported in the way of dealing with people. And you'll see this change, because this happened in 1681 in Virginia, Columbia. You'll see this change as British East India Company starts dealing with Indians. Madras was built in the 17th century, in the 1640s something. You won't hear of these kind of behavior, but in the 1740s, 1750s, 1780s, you'll hear this. You hear this behavior. And that mindset has actually influenced a lot. And history teaching and understanding is also influenced because these people have written the history. We need to understand this process to actually discover what we want to understand.
To add one thing to what he said, you'll be very surprised to learn that the first slaves were not Africans. They were the British. They were stolen from the hinterland, taken to Bristol. I went there, I went and saw the place where they had the ships and where the white slaves were taken. So the first slaves who went were white men, and then of course black, brown, everyone.
Thank you for that invigorating Q&A session. And I now request Group Captain Vijay Kumar to present a memento to the Chief Guest and other dignitaries on behalf of MMA.
Again, before all, we give you only books to read. It's a lovely book to write, The Turning Point. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure meeting you.
I now request Captain Ramchandran to present a memento to our Chief Guest, Dr. Nandita Krishnan. I now request Captain Ramchandran to present a memento to our special speaker for the event, Air Marshal M. Mateshwaran.